Thank you for being here. My name again is Julie Kuo, and I am the Ballast Water and Whole Fouling Coordinator for the state. I work out of the Department of Land and Natural Resources Aquatics Division, and I'm trying to set my timer so I don't go over here. So as Tyler was mentioning, I will be discussing the top 2 vectors of aquatic invasive species or non-indigenous species arriving into Hawaii. And to start, I'd like to ask the group who has seen the movie The Aliens. Raise your hand. Half the group? No, really? Okay, well, besides being or having an amazing resemblance to a larvation, which is about 2 millimeters in size, just cut off the head and you stick a body on it, that's what they look like. They are also good analogies for non-indigenous species or aquatic invasive species in Hawaii. So I'd like to kind of just define right now what a non-indigenous species is. They can also be known as non-native or alien species, which means they're not originally from Hawaii. They may not have a significant environmental impact or human health impact, as well as to the native fauna. And some non-native species might even be beneficial for removing certain other invasive pest species. However, a non-indigenous species may become invasive when they start having environmental and human health impacts. So as you can see here, this alien has basically glommed onto a person's face, and that's kind of the analogy of maybe an organism that might cause disease to someone, or the alien that's kind of standing on top of the coral right there. Basically, invasive species become invasive, or excuse me, non-indigenous species become invasive because they have a competitive advantage over the local species. They can reproduce rapidly, they're not picky eaters, and they're adaptable to the local environment, whether it's the weather or just being able to take over prime real estate in coral habitats. So, how many non-indigenous species are currently established in Hawaii? 417. This is an example of a worm or a feather duster worm that has come over and established, and then here's an invader algae. The breakdown of the non-native species that have established here include arthropods as being kind of the largest chunk, which an example of that is like a mantis shrimp. Mollusks, we got tunicates, algae, cnidarians, and annelids. So again, most of the non-indigenous species that have established here in Hawaii, the aquatic ones, are solely based of invertebrates and algae. Just to give you some reference as to other areas that non-indigenous species have established, continental US, they've got 450. So that's almost the equivalent to the state of Hawaii. So it's kind of scary. San Francisco Bay possesses half of the non-indigenous species that have established in the continental US. New Zealand's got 206, Australia at 160, and Australia, keep in mind, is as big as the continental US, and Europe's got 546. And what a study that came out in 2014 basically found was that about 80% of the non-indigenous marine algae and invertebrates have come over by vessel biofouling, so the attachment of organisms to submerged areas of a boat or a ship, as well as ballast water. And I'll get into more detail as to what those two are. So, as you well know, we live in the middle of the Pacific. We rely very heavily on the shipping industry to bring over more than 80% of our consumer goods. So that includes furniture, cars, office supplies, pretty much everything that you see in this room, 80%. They go through treacherous waters to bring over our consumables, but the consequence is that these organisms get also brought over through these 2 vectors, vessel biofouling and unmanaged ballast water discharge. So what is biofouling and how does it accumulate? Within 1 hour to 24 hours, organisms can recruit to the vessel hull, the submerged areas of the vessel. And you can see on the right side a picture of a hole underneath water. And what you would see within that 1 hour to 24 hours is pretty much nothing. It's kind of like the slime layer. So biofouling can be broken down into two different groups. Microfouling, that small, tiny organism recruitment, which is composed of microscopic algae, like this cute little star diatom here. And there's another type of diatom. It's a Cattosaurus, and then here's some dinoflagellates. So again, within 24 hours, they recruit to the vessel hull. Within 24 hours to a week, you still don't really see much. There's maybe a slime layer, some organisms that have kind of grouped together, but it's still pretty minimal if you jump into the water and look at the hole. Then around 2 weeks to a month, you start seeing more adult growth. Organisms that can reproduce, that can put out propagules and become that organism that you see at the bottom to adult size. That's a tunicate. So what are we supposed to do? How do you manage that biofouling? Well, there are best management practices currently developed in different countries, as well as in California, the state of California. And the International Maritime Organization has also come out with best management practices for addressing microfouling and macrofouling. And some of those best management practices include monitoring where you go. So maintaining a record log of your locations visited, the itinerary, how fast you were going, layup periods, how long were you docked, because the longer that you're docked, the more accumulation of those organisms you'll get over time. As well as you want to monitor also how often you're cleaning and conducting inspections on your biofouling. Another BMP, best management practice, is to maintain your whole anti-fouling paint to manufacturer specs. So some manufacturers might say, well, you need to repaint every 2 years. Some might say you can use this paint for 5 years and not have to touch it, that sort of thing. So make sure that if you own a vessel or know someone that owns a vessel, to ask them to read the directions on how to maintain your biofouling. The BMPs might include how to manage the microfouling. So for these, again, algae, slime layer, very minimal organisms, small organisms, you might use something that's much less abrasive. So maybe a cloth just to clean off that slime layer, or some brush, nothing too harsh. Specifically, niche areas are more prone to biofouling compared to the sides of the holes. So if you can imagine, you're on a boat, the boat's moving, the sides of the boats are going to receive much more impact by the water, so the organisms will get flushed off. Whereas the niche areas, which include like the rudder hinge, the propeller of that boat or that ship, the sea chest, bilge keel, those areas are not receiving as much push from the water, so they tend to accumulate more organisms more easily. So here's another example of a boat that has niche areas, different niche areas from the previous vessel that you saw. And they could include deck fittings, anchor well, and anchors. So if you can imagine, the anchor goes into the water, it comes back up. If you don't dry it out, it's going to have non-native species in it potentially. So it's important to manage those areas as well. Cooling pipes, bilge tanks, water inlets, the keel, the bottom part of the boat that controls the stability of that boat, propeller, the shaft, the rudder, all those areas are considered niche areas and require more focus in terms of biofouling management. For macrofouling, as you recall, are these adult organisms which you can visually see. If you jump into the water, you look at a boat, you can see these organisms growing on the boat as opposed to microfouling, which is just that slime layer again. So here are a couple examples. And if you don't manage your biofouling, you may end up with a boat that looks like that, really nasty, 20 inches, almost as tall as that guy. And there's different ways to manage macrofouling. So again, you should look into the anti-fouling paint manufacturer specifications on how to manage the different paints you got on your boat. There's the safest option, which is to haul it out and to clean it on the surface. And of course, you want to also manage those organisms. You don't just want to push it all back into the ocean. You want to take it and throw it into the trash can, put it somewhere where it doesn't get back into the ocean. And then there's also new technology to manage biofouling, this macrofouling. And I'll get into more detail as to what that might entail. So a couple examples of managing macrofouling might include a system. So just imagine you're on the boat, there's an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, so it's like a drone but underwater, right? You use this cool little control unit. It gets lowered into the water. It goes along the side of the hull. It has a vacuum suction, so as it's cleaning the hull with some brushes, it's sucking out the debris, sucking out the potential paint that's removed. That water is passed through 1 filter, 2 filters, maybe 3 filters to kick out that debris. It might go through a UV treatment before the water goes back into the ocean. So this is what's considered a in-water cleaning debris capture system. And you might ask, well, why don't I just jump in and take a brush to the side of my boat? The reason being is if you have macroorganisms growing on it, like these barnacles, this feather duster worm in the middle, or crabs, you might pop them off. They might produce propagules, like little babies, as you see down there. And you might basically be helping them survive in our beautiful environment. So that's why we like in-water cleaning capture systems for macroorganisms. Again, for microfouling, the small little slime algae layer, it's not so much of a concern. But these larger organisms, they have much more potential for spreading non-native species into our waters. The other reason that you'd want to capture the macro organisms as well as the debris that gets removed is because the paint might have some nasty constituents in it. So some paints, actually a lot of anti-fouling paints, have copper in it as well as zinc, and those could be harmful to ocean organisms as well as to humans in high quantities. So that's why we want to capture all that debris. Another best management practice for biofouling includes developing an actual schedule for cleaning the biofouling. So doing that as well as maintaining, if you can, the biofouling at a micro slime layer level. And then inspecting and cleaning that biofouling before departing to a new location. So if you're, for example, coming from New Zealand or from California, you want to clean before you come into our Hawaii home, right? And vice versa, clean here before you go into someone else's home. While we don't have regulations to address biofouling right now in the state, excuse me, we do plan on developing them. In fact, we are currently developing regulations, excuse me. Some water here. Okay, so as I was saying, while we don't have regulations to address biofouling currently in the state, there are many other countries and the state of California who do have regulatory standards to start addressing biofouling. So we wouldn't be reinventing the wheel, we would be following the steps of California. New Zealand has also biofouling regulations. They have regulations for the vessels that stay short stay, which means they stay less than 20 days, and then for long stay vessels, which are vessels that stay more than 20 days. Australian government also has biofouling guidelines, and I understand that they're also starting to put together their regulations. And the International Maritime Organization also has plenty of good information and guidelines for how to manage biofouling, as well as standards for that for biofouling of vessels. So what would our regulations include? It would have what's called a whole husbandry form for vessel operators to fill out. It would include the vessel information. It would have when the vessel last cleaned, their biofouling, where they visited, when was their last dry docking, how old is their anti-fouling paint, all those indicators that might tell us if this vessel is at risk of bringing in non-native species. Furthermore, we would inspect the vessel, and obviously we couldn't inspect all the vessels, but we would do our risk assessment, allocate the resources towards the more risky vessels, the ones with the out-of-service anti-fouling paint, We would look at the vessels with a remotely operated vehicle, such as the one that Dan on the aquatic invasive species team is holding, and or by scuba. So switching gears now to ballast water, we are in a relatively good place in the sense that we do have ballast water regulations. It's in the Hawaii Administrative Rules, Chapter 1376. And just want to take a step back as to what ballast water is. Basically, when a ship is has removed cargo, it doesn't necessarily remove cargo from all areas on the ship equally. So it has to somehow stabilize the ship from listing or capsizing over. So it'll take in water from the port it's currently at. And some of the organisms that might be taken in are these, as shown here. These are some decapod larvae, so potentially crab or lobster or shrimp larvae. In the middle picture, there's a really funny looking dinoflagellate, which is a phytoplankton, so kind of like an algae plant. And then if those organisms are taken up and they transit across without being treated by either a UV treatment or a chemical treatment, or being exchanged in the middle of the ocean, once that vessel arrives and it needs to discharge or deballast the ballast water, it could send those organisms into the environment, and then those organisms could propagate from larva stage to adult stage and settle out into our local environment. And why are we concerned about that? Well, there have been previous studies that show fisheries collapse. There's been shellfish, toxic shellfish poisoning. People have consumed shellfish that have these harmful algae that cause amnesia, that can give you really bad diarrhea. And it's just really bad if these organisms propagate and they get out in Hawaii. There have been fisheries collapse. People have gotten sick from Vibrio cholera, which has been shown to be transferred in ballast water or unmanaged ballast water. And then it could also have impacts on tourism. So what do the regulations in the state require? They require vessels to manage their ballast water if they're coming from overseas. And what that means is they have to treat their system with a type approved, a US Coast Guard type approved treatment system, which may include UV treatment, some chemical treatment, which might involve chlorine. And I think also right now, exchange is okay. So mid-ocean exchange, meaning if you have ballast water you want to discharge from California, you got to manage it 200 nautical miles offshore any land mass before you can discharge it in the state. So those are the kind of two options there: treat it or exchange it. Something else that the regulations allow us to do is to receive ballast water reporting forms from vessels, and they have to send it to us 24 hours prior to arrival in case we have to address the vessel because it's out of compliance. And what does the reporting form include? It has information on if they have a treatment system on board, did they actually treat their ballast water, where they picked up their ballast water from, where they're coming to discharge that water. So all the information that would be important for us to conduct a risk assessment of that vessel discharging ballast water. Something else we get to do is to board vessels. And we do this right now in coordination with the US Coast Guard because we're still developing our inspection program. But basically we can board the vessel, collect ballast water using a zooplankton net. So stick that net into a manhole or potentially pump up that water from ballast tanks using a pump. So that's what the manhole looks like. And we can look at the water underneath a microscope in our lab, which we've also recently set up. However, we are also currently trying to amend the ballast water regulations for the reason that we right now haven't incorporated ballast water discharge standards as the US Coast Guard has. And their discharge standards include 3 different size classes. So the first one is greater than 50 micron organisms, which are about the size of a pin tip, really tiny. you're allowed to have you're not allowed to have any more than 10 organisms per cubic meter. And if you can imagine what a cubic meter is, it's about 1,000 liters. So this is about a liter. The size of a water bottle is a liter. So you're only allowed 10 organisms per 1,000 liters of water. That's really low, and that's good. For the 10 to 50 micron organism size class, and the equivalent of a 10 micron organism is maybe a red blood cell as a reference. You're allowed to have 10 organisms per milliliter. So a milliliter is substantially smaller in volume. So two different concentrations there. And then we would also be interested in the 3 types of bacteria: Vibrio cholera, E. coli, which is found in fecal matter, and intestinal enterococci, which also cause really nasty stomach issues if you happen to consume it. The other item we're trying to do, or what we're trying to amend the ballast water regulations with, is inter-island travel. So there was a study by Godwin, 2003, that came out showing Honolulu Harbor, Pearl Harbor, and Barbers Point Harbor, so Galileo Harbor, that essentially act as hubs for marine non-native species. And we corroborate that data also with the reporting forms that we receive. And this was something put together by my intern, Natalie, which indicates where the vessels are going. So the arrivals of these commercial vessels, like container ships, barges, they're all coming basically to Oahu. They're also going to the other islands, but most of them, as you can tell here, 822 are coming to Oahu. Most of them, again, to Honolulu Harbor, and Barbers Point is second most frequented harbor. Then you've got Big Island in the orange, which receives about 103 vessel arrivals, and this was from data from 2017. Then we got Maui in yellow at 84 arrivals, Kauai at 51, and Lanai, lonely little 1 vessel arrival, which is good because it means they've been less inundated by vessels potentially carrying non-native species. So these vessels, where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from all around the world. More specifically, though, they are coming from the area of Japan, as well as in California and Oregon. And what I want to show you here is the breakdown of the vessels that are arriving to Hawaii. So we get about 1,000 arrivals to our state from 118 different locations. And this is data actually from 2016, but not much has changed from 2016 to 2017. Most of the vessels that are coming here, which seems to make sense, is container vessels that are bringing in, again, our consumable goods. Then we have RoRos, roll-on, roll-off vessels, passenger vessels, tankers who are bringing our fuel to operate our cars. And then we got smaller compilation of arrivals from these other groups. 23% of those vessels are going inter-island, so that's why we're a little bit concerned about discharge of ballast water between these islands. And 72% of those vessels are arriving from overseas. So we care about the introduction of these organisms to our state, but within the islands, because Honolulu seems to be a location that has many more non-native species established compared to the other places. We want to protect the other locations that are a little more pristine than the areas on Oahu. So maybe one of the questions you're wondering now is why, the native habitats here are inundated by so much just issues, concerns. There's coral bleaching, there's plastic that's coming in, there's runoff, urban development, fishing pressures, unsafe coral, coral unsafe sunscreen, and then people stepping on the corals. On top of that, invasive species coming in. While I think it's not too late to address our corals, I think that we can definitely help maintain certain areas that are still pristine. And that's what I'm trying to do here with addressing biosecurity issues related to ballast water and biofouling, which again is the top 2 vectors of aquatic non-indigenous species transfer. The other thing that we would use is strategic planning. So there's 3 amazing tools, basically guides that focus our efforts in the right direction. So it's not like I'm randomly just putting together a program. I'm following these 3 guidelines to develop these 2 programs. Prevention cannot be done without collaboration. So the people that the vessels that would be regulated for these 2 vectors, we would need their help and their collaboration, as well as with federal agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, as well as our international partners too. And so what can you do to prevent introductions? Well, if you own a boat or know someone that owns a boat, you can direct them to developing a biofouling management plan. And there's a reference down there, the imrs.org, which you can access that information, a template to create your biofouling management plan. In terms of recognizing or identifying organisms in the field, there's something called the citizen scientist. Thanks, Scott Godwin. And you can basically download this onto your phone app. And since our phones sometimes they're so versatile that you can take it underwater or wrap something around it to take it underwater. You can take a picture of what you think might be a non-native species, hook it up to this, send it to this app or this website, and see if someone can help identify that organism. And this would help us greatly, because then we would start to be able to get a better understanding or be able to monitor with more eyes what organisms are becoming invasive. Additionally, you can always log on to the DLNR website, the EIS website, to look for updates, specifically the ballast water biofouling link, and support legislation. So with that, I want to thank my funding sources, HISC, Hawaii Invasive Species Council, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for providing money for my position, as well as these other agencies for assisting me in developing the ballast water and biofouling program for the state of Hawaii. And thank you all for listening. I welcome questions, and I also want to reference again the Aliens movie, because I feel like the little decapod larva on the left side is very similar to that little alien larva, and then on the right side you got the older version of the crab larva that looks like that face hugger from Aliens. So there you have it. Thank you. Yes, sir, in the back. You next.
Given a vessel, say a container vessel, how often do they treat the home? Because the paint doesn't last ever.
Mm-hmm.
So how often do they treat the home?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for different vessels, they have different requirements for when they have to dry dock. I don't know specifically for Matson, but I know that for other commercial container ships, they have to dry dock every 2 or 3 years to retreat, repaint their hull. For vessels, international vessels, I'm not sure. That it might be even less, right? It might be every 5 years or maybe even 6 years. But for most of the U.S. vessels, they tend to maintain their anti-fouling paint pretty well. I'll get to you, Robin Jr. I think there is a question. Okay, Robin Jr. Junior. Junior.
When do you think we will be able to get those underwater remote
Roomba? No, that is a good one. So we right now have a remotely operated vehicle. It's sitting in my container shed, and we use it every so often, but we're also needing to develop those protocols to inspect vessels for biofouling. So to answer your question, we already have those. If you're talking about the in-water cleaning capture systems, that is, so there's technology right now all right? Like on the market, it's being used. But in Hawaii, we're still needing to test those systems to collect data and to make sure that these systems meet water quality standards. Oh, where can you get them? Online, probably. Well, no, these systems, as of right now, I'm not familiar that and there are any in the state of Hawaii, but there is a company in Norway, as well as in Western Australia, that have developed these systems. So you can get them in those countries. But it'll cost a lot of money to ship over to Hawaii. Yes, sir?
I'm curious about the picture you have here. The picture shows the 100-inch of the points. It's a ship that has ballast. Nothing on it.
It's clean. Like not this one, right? Are you talking about this?
Yeah, that one. If I'm reading that correctly, the one up, it says, is that a hot surface? I was wondering, why is it called a hot surface?
Oh, whole surface. I'm sorry about the pixelated picture. Yeah.
Was it one L? H-U-L.
Hull. Yeah, my apologies. I stole that from the internet. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where are you from?
Originally, I am from California, but my parents are from Taiwan.
How long have you been here?
For 2 years now.
2 years.
Yeah.
Oh, you shared a lot of information. People who know me, I am a stickler for pronunciation of Hawaiian words.
Yes, it is.
We are in Honolulu.
Honolulu.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I've heard a lot of people arguments about this. Would you consider a native species as being capable of becoming an alien? Because native species are capable of out-competing their fellow native, but are they technically alien or are they invasive now? There are a lot of people say yes and no to that.
It looks like Mr. Scott Godwin is aching to answer this question, so I'll hand it over to him.
I presented last week that there's I presented last week that word invasive is an ecology. Doesn't mean something happening. So an alien species can be invasive, but native species can be invasive. So the example that I presented was I worked in the Northwest Islands quite a bit, and there was a green algae that's native to Hawaii. It's called fugu. For some reason, at Kure Atoll and Pearl Hermes Atoll, that algae just went invasive, started wiping out coral all throughout the lagoons, and it had to do something with nutrient cycling that was going on. And so stuff can be native and act invasive.